Welcome to this webinar that marks a very important milestone, the 60th anniversary of Pacem and Terris. I'm Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. We're so very grateful to be able to help host this wonderful webinar marking the 60th anniversary of Pacem and Terris, hosted by Pax Christi International. Catholic Theological Union was founded just 5 years after Pacem and Terris had been issued. And so peace building has been at the center of the ministerial preparation of CTU students for our 55 years of existence. We were founded in 1968 when 3 men's communities united to form Catholic Theological Union. They were on fire with a vision for a new kind of seminary formation that would take place in an urban setting. So in Pope Francis's terms, in a setting where the sheep are and where those preparing for ministry would be right with the sheep and smell as the sheep. Also located near the University of Chicago and other schools of theology in Chicago where we could have easy access to ecumenical and interreligious exchanges. Today, there are 23 men's communities that form the union at CTU, as well as women religious and lay women and men who make up more than half of our student body. We're preparing students for all kinds of ministries in the church, and especially ministries of peace building. The highest award that we give at CTU is our Blessed Are the Peacemakers Award. If you're not busy this coming Wednesday, come join us for an event where we will honor Brian Stevenson and Donna Carroll. Peace building is at the center of our curriculum, at the center of the way that we form people for ministers. 1968 was a violent time in our country and in our city when CTU was founded. You'll remember that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated that year, Robert Kennedy right after him. And then here in Chicago in August of that year, the riots that broke out during the Democratic National Convention set the city on fire. In the midst of all of that, the founders of CTU had the instinct that the way through violence, the way toward peace building, is through uniting across boundaries of difference. And that's what we do at Catholic Theological Union. We're so grateful to be able to host Pax Christi International for this event. And so I turn it over now to your hosts from Pax Christi International. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Sister Barbara, and thank you to Catholic Theological Union for hosting us. It's lovely to be here. Thank you. Welcome to today's webinar, Pacem in Terris at 60. Is the Catholic Church heeding the gospel call to nonviolence? Brought to you by Pax Christi International. Hello, my name is Marie Dennis. I serve as the Senior Director for the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which is a project of Pax Christi International. We are very grateful that you have chosen to join us for this reflection on that great encyclical, Pacem in Terris, and on how it has formed the basis for the Catholic Church's turn toward nonviolence. Let us begin with a very brief reflection from Pacem in Terris itself. Our Lord Jesus Christ, after his resurrection, stood in the midst of his disciples and said, "Peace be upon you, Alleluia." The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord, from John 20. It is Christ, therefore, who brought us peace. Christ who bequeathed it to us. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth, do I give unto you." Also from John 14. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative CNI, is a project of Pax Christi International, as I just said, the International Catholic Peace Movement. The goal of CNI is to deepen Catholic understanding of and commitment to gospel nonviolence, and to encourage the Catholic Church to invest its intellectual, pastoral, academic, diplomatic, and financial resources in developing and promoting nonviolent practices and strategies which can help lead the world away from perpetual violence and war. In other words, to help the human community move from a logic of violence, that in which we are so trapped right now, to a logic of nonviolence. We are very happy to have two members of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative Executive Committee as panelists tonight. Ken Butigan is Professor of Practice in Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program at DePaul University here in Chicago. He has worked in a series of movements for social change, and in the 1980s was founder and national coordinator of the Pledge of Resistance. Ken earned his PhD in the Historical and Cultural Studies of Religions at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He has published 7 books and is a strategy consultant with Pacem Nonviolence Service, which has trained tens of thousands of people in the power of nonviolent change. Sister Wamuyu Wachira is a member of the Loreto Sisters in Nairobi, Kenya. She serves as co-president of Pax Christi International with French Bishop Marc Stanger. Wamuyu received her MA in Applied Theology, Peace and Justice Studies, and her PhD on experiences, and did her PhD research on experiences of violence in schools in Kenya. She is currently a lecturer and a program leader in peace and conflict studies at St. Paul's University in Nairobi, and has been deeply involved in Pax Christi's nonviolence training program for youth and religious sisters in East Africa and in Africa's Great Lakes region. A welcome to you both. A note on questions. Please feel free to write your questions at any time during this program. There is a question tag on the webinar screen. And when we finish, we'll answer as many questions as possible after the 2 presentations. We hope that we'll have time for that exchange. And we welcome Ken first.
Thank you, Marie. It's a great pleasure to be back at Catholic Theological Union, where some years ago I taught a summer course and later led a workshop. But I especially remember with great fondness the honorary doctorate that my friend and longtime colleague, Franciscan Friar Louis Vitale, received from CTU some years ago. His acceptance speech was short and to the point. Louis got up and said, "I've discovered in my life that love is what matters in the end. And all I can say is, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you." And then with one final rousing, "I love you," he sat down and the place exploded. Louis has been my great teacher in the way of gospel nonviolence, which in its most basic sense is love in action, a love that seeks justice, peace, and reconciliation in our lives and our world. How? By challenging violence, by striving to dismantle injustice, to resolve conflict, to repair harm, and to heal trauma, all without violent means. Like his great teacher, Francis of Assisi, Louis has found many ways to put that love into action, including nonviolent resistance by entering war zones for peace, by walking with the poor, by challenging training for torture, and by protesting the devastation of the earth at places like the Nevada desert and the Nevada test site. Louis began his formation as a Franciscan just when the Second Vatican Council was beginning. There is little doubt that Pacem and Terris was a great prompt to the life of nonviolent change he took up, and so many others did as well. So many others have been inspired directly or indirectly by the moral force and clarity of Pacem and Terris, including perhaps many of us watching tonight, and certainly Pax Christi International, with its network of 120 organizations spread across every continent on our planet. So we're here tonight to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Pacem and Terris and the ceaseless waves of nonviolent action it has unleashed over the succeeding decades. We're here to celebrate how Pax Christi International has ridden those waves all over the world, buoyed by its vision of justice for all, peace for all, and the fullness of life for all. And we are here to celebrate a new wave that has been building since the installation of Pope Francis 10 years ago. This is the Pope who recently met with 3 French activists and told them, start a revolution, shake things up. The world is deaf. You have to open its ears. Francis himself has been just such a revolutionary. What has been clear from the beginning of his papacy is that what's needed is a nonviolent revolution. When it came time to designate his prayer intention for this month, April 2023, Francis wanted to mark the 60th anniversary of Pacem and Terris by calling the world to pray for a, quote, nonviolent culture. He sent out a message to the 300,000 people on his prayer network saying, quote, let us make nonviolence, both in daily life and in international relations, a guide for our actions. And let us pray for a greater diffusion of a culture of nonviolence, which involves the lesser use of weapons, both by states and by citizens. We have learned so much from Pope Francis about nonviolence, both in word and deed, over this decade. Many of us may be familiar with his landmark 2017 World Day of Peace message entitled Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. It was the first time this annual message in 50 years was devoted to nonviolence, and it contains many powerful teachings about this practice. What is perhaps even more illustrative of his vision of nonviolence is the interview that Pope Francis gave to the Catholic News Service before its release, entitled Pope Francis, Nonviolence is Not Weakness. In this article, in this interview, he said, quote, the path of nonviolence in politics and society is the path to pursue now and in the future. This is the way of peace, not a peace proclaimed by words, but in fact denied by pursuing strategies of domination, backed up by scandalous outlays for arms, while so many people lack the very necessities of life. The choice of nonviolence as a style of life is increasingly demanded, the Pope says, in the exercise of responsibility at every level, from family education to social and civil commitment to political activity and international relations. In every situation, the Pope says, this means rejecting violence as a method for resolving conflicts and dealing with them instead through dialogue and negotiation. He goes on to say, this is not the same. Nonviolence is not the same as weakness or passivity. Rather, it presupposes firmness, courage, and the ability to face issues and conflicts with intellectual honesty, truly seeking the common good over and above partisan interests, be it ideological, economic, or political. He goes on to say that despite so many wars and genocides of unheard of proportions over the past century, there still has been, quote, outstanding examples of how nonviolence embraced with conviction and practiced consistently can yield significant results also on the social and political plane. But Pope Francis has shown us that nonviolence is not only a matter of words, it is action, nonviolent action, which he has engaged in throughout his papacy, from entering the war zones in the Central African Republic to be with the Muslim population as they were surrounded by armed Christian militia forces, to making a surprise visit to a refugee camp in Greece, from which he brought 3 Muslim families to live in Rome, to making a pilgrimage of repentance, seeking reconciliation with the First Nations in Canada who were deeply harmed by boarding schools run by Catholic religious communities. Perhaps the most dramatic nonviolent action of Pope Francis took place in 2017, when at the end of a retreat for peace, he had arranged for competing leaders in the middle of the civil war in South Sudan. He abandoned his script and said, "I beg you as a brother to stay the course of peace. I appeal to you with all my heart, move ahead as one." And then he unexpectedly bent down and kissed the shoes of the president and those of the opposition leaders in South Sudan. He stunned his guests with this altogether surprising gesture. Quote, "I was shocked and I trembled when His Holiness the Pope kissed our feet," the president told the South Sudanese parliament a month later. There were continued to be serious ups and downs in South Sudan since then, but the next February, the parties finally formed a unity government. This nonviolent action was a powerful prelude to Pope Francis's recent visit to the country this past February, which in turn helped to inspire a recent robust commitment by the South Sudanese Council of Churches to nonviolence as a key way forward across the country. Francis, in many places, has lauded Pacem and Terris. I believe this is because he recognizes not only its historic significance in its own right, but because of the remarkable impact it has had on Catholics and non-Catholics alike worldwide, casting a vision that to be a person of faith and conscience is to be a peacemaker. The spirit of Pacem and Terris has imbued his papacy, but it is also the case that Francis himself has built on these foundations to take the church and the world to the next level of peace and nonviolence. And this next level, this new direction, will be an embrace, we believe, of nonviolent action and the way Francis has been pointing us to it. Tonight, I invite us to gain a firmer grasp of this by going back to Pacem and Terris and its emergence. I want to suggest that Pacem and Terris was born out of nonviolent action and is itself a kind of nonviolent action. Finally, I want to suggest we may be on the verge of an even deeper possibility of Jesus's nonviolence, moving more from the margins of the church to the center, spreading the nonviolent action that is so critical to the transformation of the church and the world today. We may even be getting set to take up Pope Francis's challenge of going for nonviolent action, starting a revolution, shaking things up, and opening the world's ears. To prepare for the opening of the Second Vatican Council, Pope John the 23rd issued an encyclical in July 1962 entitled Penitentiam Agere. This papal letter was a call for Catholics worldwide to undertake spiritual preparation in the months before the beginning of the council in October of that year. One Catholic inspired by this encyclical was Lanza del Vasto. Born in Italy, Del Vasto lived and worked with Mohandas Gandhi in India for 6 months in 1936. Gandhi gave him a new name, Shantidas, servant of peace. Eventually, he returned to Europe to found a Gandhian order in the West, which he called the Community of the Ark. Like Gandhi, the community mounted numerous nonviolent action campaigns, including resisting the French war in Algeria, nuclear weapons, torture, conscription, and the extension of military base in southern France. In response to the Pope's encyclical, Del Vasto traveled to Rome in March 1963 for perhaps his greatest nonviolent action. Unlike the high drama of some of the campaigns that he had organized previously, this witness was a calm and contemplative one. Like Gandhi, Del Vasto believed in the power of fasting and had decided to take up a fast with a specific intention: to reply to Pope John the 23rd's request for spiritual ascesis by undertaking a practice aimed at quietly inviting the Pope to take action himself by issuing a clear and unambiguous statement on world peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which had taken place just a few months before, had sharpened public awareness of the terror of the nuclear arms race. The time was right for a clear declaration on peace. Moreover, Del Vasto was gravely concerned that a Swiss archbishop had recently endorsed nuclear arms without being challenged by Rome. Not only was the world in grave peril, Del Vasto believed that the very soul of the church was at risk. Del Vasto felt that it was critical that the Pope issue a clear call for nuclear disarmament and for peacemaking. Del Vasto's 40-day fast was not a hunger strike. He did not alert the press. It was a hidden act of prayer and penance conducted in the Cistercian monastery outside Rome. Its prayerful spirit guided the letter he sent to the Pope at the start of the fast, which was later published in his 1975 book, Warriors of Peace, Writings on the Techniques of Nonviolence. He began his letter in this way: Holy Father, in answer to your appeal, I have come from France to Rome to do penance for the sake of the council. I am going to fast until Easter morning and thus offer up 40 days of intense silent prayer. There are 3 reasons for doing this. The first is consciousness of the sins that make me unfit to address my prayer to heaven. The second is the prayer itself, that our Pope be given health, for he has won our affection by trying to change pontifical majesty into fatherly kindness. The third is our hopeful longing, in the face of the threat of total war, for the message of peace the world needs today, the bold, absolute, in short, the evangelical word. The letter opens with a focus on the power of prayer. Del Vasto's fast was not a public act. It was not a confrontation. It was not a petition. It was not a manifesto. It was an appeal, but it was much more. Most profoundly, this was a spiritual practice, a form of prayer in which presence opened to presence in silence and hope. Del Vasto's letter made a number of arguments. In the midst of the terror of the mad logic of our times, which could touch off nuclear destruction maliciously or accidentally, it is the church's role to, quote, warn, exhort, implore, and show the way out. But this would carry no weight if the church ultimately functions as an accomplice of armed governments, the letter suggested. Unless the church is free to resist systems of violence and injustice, its pleas for peace will only be empty and alienating rhetoric. The church and its members, Del Vasto argued, must be willing to break with government authority when its policies contravene the law of God, including the law not to kill. For Del Vasto, the perennial theological stumbling block is Romans 13, which makes a religious duty of blind obedience to established power, as he put it. He then goes on to demolish what he calls the misinterpretation of Paul's passage by stressing that our allegiance is to God and not to men, and the rightly formed human conscience, which God works in and through. Anticipating the argument that such a stance will lead to anarchy, Del Vasto urges not rebellion or subversion, but what he calls spiritual resistance, which is his term for active nonviolence, and which he equates in his book, Spiritual Resistance as Active Nonviolence. He writes, spiritual resistance is quite the contrary, rebellion, subversion, and anarchy, for obedience to God rather than to men curbs power when it goes astray and serves it for the common good. Spiritual resistance is in no way a renunciation of legitimate defense or of the fight for justice. It is at all times the most legitimate defense, and in the atomic age, the only one that is reasonable and possible, the only one that does not entail the destruction of what it is pretending to defend. And finally, spiritual resistance consists in opposing evil, not by an evil of the same nature and in the opposite direction, but by an equal and opposite good. He then enumerates 4 rules for spiritual resistance. 1, that it should be carried out without bloodshed. 2, that it should be carried out without fraud or lies, openly and without evading punishment, but on the contrary, seeking it and bearing it with great dignity. 3, that it should not be carried out with respect. It should be carried out with respect for the adversary and his freedom and dignity and the care for his conversion. And finally, that it should be a testimony to the truth. It is in this spirit, Del Vasto says, that we must work to end the threat of and preparation for total war and call on all persons to break the complicity of their silence and to wake up before the irreparable happens. He closes his letter with an apology for his length, tellingly adding, the silent supplication of my total fast might have sufficed to say all of this and much, much more better than words. I have gone into seclusion and will remain hidden. Only a few friends and some dignitaries of the church know of my fast. I hope that the press will not call attention to it. Trembling, but not without hope, I lay it at your holiness's feet and in the heart of our merciful Lord, your devoted servant, Lanza Del Vasto. His son, Mohandas, named for Gandhi, who was a medical doctor, served as Del Vasto's support person during the fast. Mohandas would also go to talk to bishops and theologians about the fast and the prospect of a papal statement. For much of the fast, though, it was not even clear that the letter had reached the Pope. Finally, on the Wednesday of Holy Week, been fasting throughout Lent, Del Vasto's wife, Chantrelle, visited the Vatican Secretariat of State. The Monsignor with whom she met assured her that the letter had indeed been read, and then said very dramatically, actually, the answer is here. And he handed her the encyclical Pacem Terris, which was to be published the next day. There are things in it that have never been said, pages that might have been signed by your husband, the Monsignor said. On Good Friday, a priest from the Vatican visited Del Vasto and presented him with gifts from Pope John. 2 leather cases bearing the papal arms and containing a rosary and a medal, with an accompanying message, the special prayer of the Holy Father for Del Vasto and his spouse. On Easter Sunday, Del Vasto broke his fast. When Lanza Del Vasto read Pacem Terris, he found that 2 of the themes he had raised in his original letter to the Pope were addressed in the encyclical, Romans 13 and a critique of modern warfare. In a book he published on this experience of the fast, Del Vasto reflected on what he saw as both the unprecedented accomplishment of the encyclical and its unfinished business. As he wrote, the principle of civil disobedience, because in Pacem Terris, it had challenged this that the government is always right. The principle of civil disobedience having been admitted, it remains to define the method, that is to say, the rules of spiritual resistance or not active nonviolence, as he said. Little did Del Vasto know at the time, but this task, defining the rules of active nonviolence, would be the work of individuals, organizations, movements, and the larger church in the coming decades, in many ways inspired and urged on by the clarion call of Pacem Terris and being carried out in our own time by Pope Francis and the people of God throughout the world. Alonso del Vasto's fast, of course, is only one small factor among many others that contributed to the development and promulgation of Pacem in Terris. Two other factors carried the most weight. The first, of course, was the general atmosphere in the months after the brinkmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis was a propitious one for considering dramatic, world-shaking initiatives for peace, including a rapid negotiation of a partial nuclear ban treaty later that year between the US and the USSR. The second factor was perhaps the most important of all, the person of Pope John himself. As Angelo Roncalli, he had played many peacemaking roles as a priest, papal nuncio, and bishop both before and during World War II. But his most powerful and most recent peacemaking venture was the back channel role he played during the Cuban crisis. 3 days after the opening of the council in October 1962, US spy planes discovered that the Cuban and Soviet governments had begun to build bases in Cuba for a number of medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles. President John F. Kennedy insisted that they be removed. When the Soviet Union refused, the US established a blockade around Cuba. As Ronald Reichlach recounts about the crisis, Khrushchev in turn authorized his Soviet field commanders to launch tactical nuclear weapons if Cuba were invaded by the US. As the Russian ships approached, the blockade stood firm and ready, and the world came closer than ever to Armageddon. Millions watched the showdown on television. James W. Douglas has written a riveting account of John the 23rd's intervention in the Cuban Missile Crisis in his book, JFK Unspeakable. He describes how at the very same time the crisis was unfolding, a group of leading Soviet academics, writers, and scientists were meeting with their American counterparts in a secluded location in Andover, Massachusetts, with the purpose of seeking peace in the midst of the Cold War. Norman Cousins, the editor of the Saturday Review and a founder of the anti-nuclear group SANE, had helped pull the group together. Despite their differences, the group was dedicated to trying to find a way out of the nuclear crisis that was playing out between their two nations. Then an advisor to John the 23rd, Father Felix Morleone, joined them. He asked the group if action by the Pope would be helpful. Cousins called the White House, which said it would welcome a papal message. This set in motion behind-the-scenes communications that brought Kennedy, Soviet Premier Khrushchev, and the Pope into what Cousins would later name an improbable triumvirate, and that led John the 23rd to issue a statement which he read on Vatican radio, which included this very important paragraph. We beg all governments not to remain deaf to this cry of humanity, that they do all in their power to save peace. They will thus spare the world from the horrors of a war whose terrifying consequences no one can predict. That they continue discussions as the loyal and open behavior has great value as a witness of everyone's conscience before history. Promoting, favoring, and accepting conversations at all levels in this time is a rule of wisdom and prudence, which attracts the blessing of heaven and earth. I love the way he puts that about peace. If we do it right, it's attracting the blessing of heaven and earth. As the historian reports, with this plea, Pope John the 23rd had given Khrushchev a way out. By withdrawing now, he would be seen as a man of peace, not a coward. 2 days later, Khrushchev, an atheist who was in the middle of a propaganda war with the Vatican, agreed to withdraw the missiles. Kennedy also secretly agreed to withdraw American missiles from Turkey. Although he was dying of stomach cancer, John the 23rd continued to play a key role in fostering peace between the two global antagonists at the time. Writing Pacem in Terris would be key to this. One of the insights that these stories about Alonso del Vasto and John the 23rd underscore is that Pacem in Terris was not only a plea for nonviolent action, it was born out of nonviolent action. Pacem in Terris is the fruit of specific initiatives for peace. But Pacem in Terris is not only born from nonviolent action and a call for nonviolent action, it was also then and now a form of ongoing nonviolent action. It is an exemplar of the 4 rules of spiritual resistance that Del Vasto had enumerated in his letter to John the 23rd. Over the past half century, this nonviolent action has played an important role in a global spiritual movement for social transformation. Pacem in Terris gave new warrants for spiritually grounded nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, and what is called by some divine obedience. It has helped radically transfigure an older notion of pacifism, which was often limited to a traditional notion of non-resistance. It is difficult to imagine the emergence of innumerable nonviolent actions organized by members of the Catholic Church over the past half century without the Pacem in Terris encyclical, which offered them a legitimating frame for a Catholic spirituality of peacemaking. As theologian and activist Father John Deere has written, Pacem in Terris, quote, questioned all warfare and opened the door to a place of nonviolence and a church of nonviolence. It opened the door to rediscovery of Jesus's nonviolence and the possibility of a new embrace of nonviolence by the church. As Pax Christi International's text, Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace, emphasizes, a growing number of papal and episcopal statements have illuminated how nonviolence is a core value of the gospel. An expanding body of theological research and biblical exegesis over the past half century have also made this point. Nonviolence education, formation, and pastoral practices have begun to take root in the church. Perhaps most significant of all, Catholics throughout the world, alongside many others in a wide range of religious, social, and cultural contexts, have been consciously living the nonviolent life as a spiritual journey and as a courageous witness for justice, peace, and reconciliation, often in environments of extreme violence. Nowhere has this been more evident than during the papacy of Pope Francis. He has called relentlessly for peace and the spirit of nonviolence, keenly bringing alive in our current moment Lanza del Vasto's prescription of spiritual resistance. In fact, Pope Francis has, at least on one occasion, remarked on Del Vasto himself. He says, quote, I think of nonviolence as a perspective and a way of understanding the world, to which theology must look as one of its constitutive elements. The writings and practices of Martin Luther King and Lanza del Vasto and other peacemakers help us here. This short statement is brimming over with insight. Pope Francis is stressing that nonviolence is not simply a principle or even an ethic, but it is a perspective and way of understanding the world, a way of seeing reality, which is not separate from theology, but one of its key elements. By referencing King and Del Vasto virtually in the same breath that he is speaking of the essentials of theology, His Holiness is inexplicably linking thought and practice, as if to say nonviolent action, for which these two figures are remembered, is a way of being in the world, but also as a way to interpret and live the Christian life. Pope John had deep hopes for Pacem in Terris. As he wrote when reading through the manuscript in January of 1963, quote, I begin to pray for the efficacy of this document. Despite the violence, war, and injustice that has befallen the world since Pacem in Terris was written, it is fair to say that His Holiness's prayers were answered. Pacem in Terris opened possibilities worldwide for the Church to dramatically expand its vision and calling as a maker of peace and justice, including challenging unjust authority and doing it nonviolently. Pacem in Terris was a love letter addressed to the world, which urged people everywhere to awaken to their responsibilities to build a, quote, universal peace in truth, justice, charity, and liberty. In our own Kairos moment of extreme global violence, what is the nonviolent action which Pacem in Terris is calling us to now? Might we begin to center our church and ourselves even more thoroughly than ever in the nonviolence of Jesus, the transformation of our lives, our communities, our church, our world. Might we embark on this path by taking nonviolent action ourselves? Actions as daring as a pope bending down and kissing the shoes of warlords, action as quiet and centered as a Frenchman inspired by Gandhi fasting for a miracle in Rome. These are just two of the innumerable nonviolent actions that the world critically needs, being promoted and lived by Pax Christi International, and that each of us can promote and live in the church and the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was inspiring, challenging, new information for me about Pacem and Terris. Thank you. We really do see a wave of nonviolence, strongly encouraged by Pope Francis, that is washing over and refreshing the church. We see that it is challenging a world that is mired in violence, and that challenge is very real and practical. We'll hear Sister Wamuyu Wachira, now introduced earlier, speak about how that turn to nonviolence is practically functioning in her community and in other communities in Africa. So, Sister Wamuyu, thank you.
Peace to you all, and welcome to this holy ground, the CTU, and the holy ground where you each one are listening to us today. We have heard from Ken about the history of Pacem in Terris, a very profound story of love. So I'm going to share what this journey of nonviolence means. And I am going to share from an African context. You see, they are training young people and religious sisters on active nonviolence and peace building. Slide 1, please. That is a map of Africa. Africa is a jigsaw puzzle, very beautiful, with stories of hope and stories of challenges. This is the place where we are journeying with the young people and religious sisters to actualize this nonviolent living. In the year 2016, Pax Christi Network met in South Africa to discuss what this journey means. And I will be inviting us today or tonight, depending on your time framework tonight. We will be sharing on what this journey has been for us, Pax Christi International, through the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. There was another meeting also in Nairobi to continue this journey. And recently in December in Rome, where we had some people also from Africa sharing this journey. I would like to say that in Africa, there are children who have been born in war, have lived in war, and have also died in war, so never experienced peace. There are women who have never experienced the joy of breastfeeding a child because of war. They are young men who have never experienced the vitality of being young, the joy of discovery, the joy of being young, the potential as a young person because of war. There are men in Africa that have never had the joy of meeting other men to discuss issues, to even share a drink together, to bond because of war. And that's why we are gathered here, to reflect on this and to see what can we do. And sometimes we may think that the journey of nonviolence is a dream, is utopia. And I stand here to share stories of young people and religious sisters who are actually deconstructing that narrative and telling us that it is possible to have another world that is not marred by violence. And so those are the stories I am going to share with you. Slide 2. So the Pax Christi International in the Great Lakes has been journeying with young people and religious sisters to show what a nonviolent life can look like. So we have had young people trained and sisters in the DRC Congo, in Rwanda and Burundi. Slide 3. So there are those key pillars that we are using and that are very, very important for us. One pillar is to educate, the other is to empower, and the other is to enrich. What do we mean by education in this context? Education in Africa is key as the gateway to opportunities for young people, and not only for young people, but for their families as well, and their future. A young person who is educated will eventually get a job, take care of his siblings, his parents, and later on have an opportunity to marry and have his own family. Or the other way around, also a girl, the same opportunities for boys and girls. So when education is not provided, then the opposite is true. Education also means removing young people from violent situation or encouragement to war. For example, in a place in Kenya where I come from, young people are engaged in what we call cattle rustling. They use arms to steal cattle from each other because cattle is not just animals. Cattle means wealth, and when they get the wealth, they can marry. If they can't get the wealth, they can't marry. So it kind of cuts their lives. So when they are educated, then we remove them from violence. So education becomes key to a non-violent living. Empowering here, we are not talking about giving people power. They have the power in them. The young people have the power in them. So it's us journeying with them and accompanying them. So that's what we have been doing in Africa, accompanying the young people. They already have the seed is in them, but they need somebody to encourage. As much as they're involved in violence, they are also involved in peace building. So we want to decrease more the violence and encourage them to a non-violent living. So empowering. Then enriching in some parts that we are in now, like in the Congo, we have tried to encourage young people to begin businesses that they are attracted to get them out of violence. Normally in Africa, especially during election times, young people are lured by politicians to get into violence as they fight for the particular candidate. So when the young people are not enriched through projects, for instance, what happens, they become an easy target. They also become an easy target to militia groups. And these militia groups are not only during election times, they are also within the community. Like most communities have a militia group that they can use when need be. So enriching young people becomes very, very important. We go to the next slide, slide 4. So the training of trainers. We find that at present, we have 120 young people trained as trainers. And this was in the DRC Congo, but in other places, we also have others. Because we are training them so that they have the skill to go out there and train other young people. So the training is focused on themselves first, so that they know what is it to live a nonviolent life, so that they can model that to their peers and also to their families. Slide 5, please. And we are mainly focusing on schools and youth movement. As you can see from the slides that are showing there, that because schools are very key to training children on nonviolent living. Because if a child knows, just as we teach a child to know the right and wrong, when they learn the values of nonviolence, which actually they are taught by their mothers and they model them. For instance, the virtue of mercy, the virtue of sharing, of compassion, of truth, honesty, justice, and peace. These are values I remember myself as a child. I learned from my grandmother, from my mother. So children in Africa actually have these values. However, if these values are not inculcated in schools, they learn them at home, then this should be inculcated again in the school setting. So these trainings we are having, we are basing on what the children already have from their parents. And after we train them, then we send them out there to model them in their schools or model them in their communities. So about 9,000 young people have received these trainings. And I would like to speak more on the group that I'm talking about, which is a militia group in the youth movement there, because the militia groups are these young people that are taught they have arms. And I'll be sharing just a few stories later. And so if these groups are not trained so that they can return back to those values, then they will perpetuate a culture of violence. So it becomes very, very important that we capture them as well. And normally this group is not in the school setting. That's what we have to remember, that they are mainly within the community. And so they can destabilize a whole community or a whole nation. Slide 6, please. So such groups need to be trained in entrepreneurship, because that is a pathway to economic sustenance. Because a lot of these militia groups, they engage in violence because that's the only option they have. So we, through experience, found out that if we teach them about active nonviolence and peace building and have nothing else, to give only teaching, then a lot of them, they'll carry the teaching, but end up going back when the time comes. So we found out that we need to also enrich them so that they do not go back there. And so that's why these trainings become very, very important, where at least they get a little income to start businesses so that they are not attracted. And as I shall be sharing some stories, you will find that that is already happening thanks to the Pax Christi International through the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, that these young people have been removed from violence to peace. Next slide, please. So we can see these are just samples of those young people that we have managed to reach out to. There are many more because these young people have reached others. So we still are doing evaluation to find out how many more have they reached out to. So you can see that those are young women doing tailoring, young men, bakery. We have others, what we call, we don't call them motorcycle in most of our communities. We call them boda boda in Kenya, like because they carry people from one border to another or from one county to another. People are also using them as taxis. They are very easy to maneuver in difficult places. And then you have some keeping pigs. So they may look very small, but these projects have actually lifted these young people and their families out of poverty. And poverty is actually one of the reasons why young people engage in violence. Next slide. So I want us to look at the impact these trainings are having on these young people. And I would like to share a few, about 3 or 4 stories, which I personally experienced. So this was not told to me. As I engaged with young people during the evaluation of this training, because we train them and then we evaluate, there was one young person who shared a story, and he said, before I got this training, I used to love, when somebody hurts me, I used to hit back until I would see them bleeding for me to know that I've hurt them badly, so they will never do that again to me. But now, after this training, I am able to call that person, we sit down and we talk about it, and it is working. And then he said, I want more of this. I want more of this training. Another story is from a woman who had very low self-esteem. And she was sharing and said, look, I used to go and sit down in the group. I was not able to speak. I was not able to do anything. My husband was abusive to me. But when I came to this training, I realized I'm a person. I learned the skill of communicating. I got to know that as a woman, I have a space. And I started asserting myself. And what made me happy was she said, and now I've been elected as a community leader. So I can help other women, empower other women. And today now we are moving together as women. We have come together and the men are feeling more challenged. That is another story. The other story is from my classroom setting, because I teach about peace and conflict studies. But I got the students trained in active nonviolence and peace building. And one student, as I was teaching, told me, look, yes, as you are teaching us, I want to tell you, I am a militia. And I left my gun with my grandmother. So here I am, you are teaching me, but when I go home, what do I do? He's from Sudan. He said, every night I can't sleep because they come and use bombs to get us out of our homes. So how do you tell me not to use my gun? And this is happening. How do I protect my father? How do I protect my family? Yes, I understand this is a very good training, but how? So I actually told him, look, I cannot tell you not to use your gun. I can't tell you that because I don't know your situation. However, what I'm training you for is that you reflect on it, ask yourself the questions, and maybe someday this may be of help to you. Today, that student, he's my student in peace, and I'm speaking because he has given me permission to speak about it. He told me now, he's about to finish his studies. He said, now I can see, in fact, I've started a project. He gave me his project to read. And that project, he's saying that he's going to pick to join with other militia, his other friends who are militia. And they are going to use the nonviolence to train those others so that they can keep away from the guns. So for me, if I did not teach anything except that, I'm a very, very happy lecturer today because of that. So he's going back, not as a militia, but he's going back to train other young people to get out of violence. I think what helped is that I did not tell him, leave the gun, but challenged him to reflect on what he had learned. So the education becomes very key. It gives them opportunities to critique the world in which they are in, the world of violence. And there have been many other stories. If you go to slide 9, these sisters you are saying, we are training also sisters. And you can see from the list what we are training them for. All what you are seeing there. We have trained 86 sisters. And we are training them in different contexts, as you can see there from the list. And these sisters are journeying with young people. However, they cannot journey with them unless they themselves are freed from violence. So a lot of the sisters have had this feedback. They are telling me, from the time you trained us, now we are solving our own violence in our communities. So when we go to young people, we already are free in ourselves. Because sisters have trauma sometimes because they are journeying with people who are traumatized. So they need that training for themselves to free themselves out of this violence in themselves. So we have that ongoing. And one of the sisters actually in South Sudan is training the militia groups who are in the bush. But they have come and they have told her, we want more of this. However, you train us, but what do we do? So this is the type of group that we feel, okay, fine, we train them and then give them something else to do so that they can stop going to be militia. And why the sisters? We are choosing sisters because sisters still have a place in society. They are seen as bridges of peace. They are also seen as the prophetic voice among the community. So that's why we are focusing on sisters. And of course, young people are the present and the future leaders of our nations, of our world. So I would have liked to say more, but because of the time, I would like to stop there and end with what Ken started with, the issue of Pope Francis inviting us to go out there and make a difference, to shake the world up, so that when we shake, the ears can open, the hearts can open, so that people can listen to a message of peace, so that people can know that another world is possible, a world that is non-violent, a world that follows the gospel of non-violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wamuyu. You make it very real. Your story about the young man in Sudan so caught my attention because I was so recently in South Sudan and heard so many stories about the deep, complex violence present often at a grassroots level. And to imagine a young man going back home and gathering his friends who are in the militia to begin to imagine a different way of dealing with, even with conflict and other violence. So I would just invite Ken and Wamuyu to maybe say a little bit to each other in response to your presentations, any questions, and then we have some questions that have already been asked by those who are participating from a distance. So, Ken.
So, Wamuyu, I was very struck by the fact that what I'm hearing is you believe that it's possible to build a culture or maybe cultures of active, liberating, transforming nonviolence. And I was especially struck by your discovery that people who get this training that you're part of in turn are training other people. I wonder about your own experience. Could you share what you could be doing? A lot of things. You went and got a PhD in peacemaking and peace building. Would you be willing to share with us a little bit of your journey? Why did you go down this road? If you're at whatever level you feel comfortable sharing with us.
Okay. So I would like to share two experiences. One is from my parents, who are very passionate about fighting for justice in their communities. And I remember my mother and my mother saying that before you welcome any visitor, before you open the gate for a visitor, you need to open your heart, the gate to your heart. So for me, that was when I look back, it was showing me that you don't close the door to anybody. So the idea of loving all irrespective of who they are. And for me, that is the first value of nonviolence, that we love even those we consider enemies. Because once you open your heart, anybody can come in. So that was the first I learned from my mother. And then from my father, he used to accompany people who are disadvantaged. They would come to him and request that, oh, I cannot get my benefits. My husband has died, I'm not able to get, and my father would accompany that old woman and help her get her justice. So for me, they were epitome of peace and the example. The other one was when I was a principal of a school. And during that period, a school, one of the schools, 2 boys burnt to death, their colleagues, 67 of them. And I questioned, how can students, reach that level of violence to kill 67 of their colleagues? And that's when I said, I have to do some study on this. And I went to do my PhD about finding out, is there another way that young people, what makes young people do such an act? And from that study, I realized that our schools have what we call systemic violence. And if that is not addressed, we have kind of cycles. So that was the trigger for me doing this. And I'm happy I am doing this now.
Thank you. Thank you, Wamuyu. Any questions for Ken?
Yes, Ken. Ken, it's for the first time I actually understood and hearing the story of Pacem in Terris. It's, the background of it. So from your own, day-to-day living, how do you see that rooting itself in your situation at the university?
Right, so I teach, as you heard, at DePaul University here in Chicago, and I have been struck by the fact that so many young people today are hungry for an alternative to the violence, not only in this city, but across this country and around the world. The violence in our communities, the violence against the earth. And so I am struck by that hunger and that longing. And so, like many of us, we are trained in a system of violence. We're trained that the response to conflict is either passivity or some version of violence, accommodating it, running away from it, or somehow using counter violence. And students come into my classes with those scripts. And what we do is open the space for seeing that there are many people around the world, like what you're doing in Kenya, who are opening the spaces to a third way beyond passivity or violence. They're finding out that nonviolence has two hands. On the one hand, I will not cooperate with this injustice, because so many people think nonviolence is passive, but it's actually two hands. I will not cooperate with this injustice, but instead of doing this, I'm going to turn this hand down and say, but I'm open to you as a human being. And I think we're learning that if we don't get this dynamic and learn this dynamic and train in it the way you're doing in Kenya, then it's hard to see how we get through the 21st century. So learning those two hands of nonviolence, and then the many examples of people around the world that are making, that opens the imagination to those alternatives. The university I'm at went through a process around its mission. It had a long, for decades, the same mission statement, a rambling four-page statement. And with 700 stakeholders came to the decision that justice, peace, and nonviolence were at the heart of the school. And it's made a commitment to not only training in justice and anti-racism and all sorts of change, but also in active and creative nonviolence as part of the training of the largest Catholic university in the United States.
Thank you, Ken. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions from our participants. Violence is multidimensional. We've been talking about violence on the ground, if you will, in local communities. And we've been talking about a culture of violence. The first question is, we've been taught by our country and church to believe in American exceptionalism, even when that belief involves the use of war. Truly, can nonviolence prevail when our own Catholic president in this country and prominent bishops justify our obscene delivery of weaponry to Ukraine? Thoughts about that?
So at the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and at DePaul University, and what I'm hearing, what Wamuyu is about in Kenya, we are committed to building a culture of active and creative nonviolence. And that means resisting the uses of those kinds of force and violence. And we specifically have been inviting the church to rediscover what Jesus taught us, to love our enemies, to put down our sword. And we're fortunately living in a time when the social sciences have shown to us that there's a quantifiable finding that nonviolent strategies are twice as effective as violent ones. Professor Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, Chenoweth at Harvard and Maria Stephan, who at one time worked for the U.S. Institute of Peace, have published arduous research that shows that over the last 100 years, nonviolent strategies were twice as effective as violent ones. And this so surprised Chenoweth, who had their background in global terrorism, military science, and believing that violence really was the answer, took up this study just to actually show that that was the case, and was blown away by running the numbers. So we're about the process of sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly, helping people understand that they have options and resisting the government or the church when that kind of what we think increasingly is not only a more immoral answer, but also an ineffective answer, that violence is not solving these conflicts. So we're about building that culture. And I think that the good thing is that the possibilities of nonviolent options is increasingly being seen. But as we learned from our friend Wamuyu from Kenya, that requires discipline and training. It requires an understanding of an alternative. And it requires not only training for training's sake, but training to train trainers out in the society. When I started as an activist many years ago, there was none of this. Peace studies programs didn't exist. We had to get it really by the seat of our pants. That's beginning to change. It will only change, though, with movements and people taking those steps of training and sharing this possibility.
Thanks, Ken.
I'd like to add that I think education is very key and modeling for children, a peaceful, non-violent way, because if we do that as parents, then they don't have to obey a leader who is saying it's okay. The parent, you begin teaching the child, this new way, and then as they grow, when they now go to university or whatever, they already have, their mindset is changed from early age. So they don't have to obey a leader who is telling them the opposite, because the education begins from birth, actually. In fact, inside, let me say inside, even before the child is born, from the parent. So I think for me, education becomes key as well, what Ken is saying. So we begin from that level and then we continue. Yeah.
Thank you, Wamuyu. Another question, and we're watching the time as we approach the end of our time. Another question, a person asked about Pax Christi International and the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative stand on asking the Pope to rescind the doctrine of discovery. We were delighted just in the last week that when the Vatican did, in fact, repudiate the doctrine of discovery. I think there is still much attention needed to the consequences of how that doctrine, as it was called, has been interpreted, including into US law, but a really important positive step was taken recently. Another question is, how should we address the violence that exists between those in power and those without power, and those with wealth and resources and those without? Your thoughts on that, either? Wamuyu?
I think that's what, for me, it's very, very important for people to kind of re-educate the mind, because often these power dynamics happen because of otherness, people feeling you are different from me. when I'm the top, the person at the bottom is different from me. But the minute we begin that core gospel value of knowing that everybody is important, nobody should be left behind, then our thinking shifts. And therefore, when we choose leaders, we are choosing leaders with integrity, leaders that have that value first. Yeah, instead of, because when we choose people because of other values, maybe wealth or whatever, then this reality becomes real. But if we ourselves know the values that we stand for, then those are the values we expect of our leaders, so that we don't have this, we need to bridge this gap. And the only way for me to bridge the gap is on how the choices we make on a daily basis.
Thank you, Wamuyu.
May I
Yes,
respond to that?
yes,
too?
Ken.
Thank you, Wamuyu. Well, I start from the premise that we have more power than we think. We're taught that we have no power. And our job actually is to claim that power. There are two kinds of power. There's the power over and power with. The power I think we have at our disposal is this power with energy and connection, that people power. And that my experience is that policymakers, power holders, the government, whatever, when they come into office, they get a mission statement and a job description. At the top it says, don't let anybody realize that they have power. That's really how governments often operate. And so we have learned over the last century, especially, of the power of nonviolent movement building. And that's so critical to both exercising that power and creating the conditions for more justice, more peace. In any of those cases, that's typically come from that kind of organizing. So we're totally hoping to see more of that. And the great thing is we're living in a time when, in spite of all the violence and injustice around the world, there's on every continent, people are exercising that people power. And if anybody's ever interested in that, you can go to the Global Nonviolent Action Database that has documented 1,200 campaigns that have used active nonviolence to win all kinds of forms of justice and peace.
Thank you, Ken. The one other question, and then I think we're going to have to answer the rest in writing. How do you see Pacem and Terris and nonviolence acting against gun violence in the US? It's killing our youth and our children. And I guess I would like to point to the fact that I believe that only nonviolence and the guidance that came initially from the gospel, but certainly through Pacem and Terris, that it's only through nonviolence that we're going to actually overcome the kind of violence that is flooding the United States. One of the directions in which the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been directing our attention has been to the question of what policies at different levels would make a difference, would support nonviolent alternatives. So both doing the kind of training and education that Wamuyu and Ken have been talking about in our own country at every level, beginning with the youngest children all the way to adults. How do we deal with conflict, with potential frustration without using violence? And then I think we have to turn to our policymakers to convince them by our nonviolent organizing that they should pass laws that restrict access to guns and to ammunition and so on. So I think that it really is only through nonviolence that we can begin to make a difference. We have some other wonderful questions, but I think we're going to need to move toward the end. We wanted to just be finished with a brief short prayer that again is based on Pacem and Terris, and then a thank you to all of you. Let us pray. This is from Pacem and Terris, with all fervor for this peace which our divine Redeemer came to bring us.
May he banish from the souls of all people whatever might endanger peace. May God transform all of us into witness of truth, justice, brotherly and sisterly love. May God illuminate with God's light the minds of rulers, so that besides caring for the proper material welfare of their peoples, they may also guarantee them the fairest gift of peace.
Finally, may Christ inflame the desires of all to break through the barriers which divide them, to strengthen the bonds of mutual love, to learn, to understand one another, and to pardon those who have done them wrong. Through God's power and inspiration, may all peoples welcome each other to their hearts as sisters and brothers.
May the peace they long for ever flower and ever reign among them. Amen. From Pacem and Terris. So I invite you to learn more about Pax Christi International and the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, to support our work in whatever way, to participate. You can scan the QR code that's on your screen now, and we will also be posting a website and an email address. I want to thank most especially the Catholic Theological Union, our wonderful tech support here, Teresa DeVivo, who's been working in the middle of the night in Brussels, the Maris and Father Ted Keating, who have helped to arrange and support our connection to the Catholic Theological Union, the board of the Pax Christi International Fund for Peace, and all of you for participating. We hope that we'll hear more from you, that you'll stay in touch, and that you'll join what really is a wave of nonviolence that is refreshing the Catholic Church, and we hope will refresh the world. Thank you.